Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and this week we will be discussing the third volume of Anthony Powell's A Dance to the Music of Time, The Acceptance World, published 1955. Now, before we dive into The Acceptance World and continue discussing the story of Nick Jenkins, our narrator, I just want to make a quick announcement, as I've been doing for the past few weeks. My second novel, Grand Tour, is coming out in September. It's the story of a young man who travels across Europe in the summer of 2012, and it's set in the world of European backpacker hostels and follows our protagonist as he tries to find meaning in his life, looks at great art, tries to understand his place in the world and his relationship to it. Not unlike many protagonists in many of the novels that we've been reading, including this one, including The Acceptance World. Powell is one of the big inspirations for my own writing. I've read Anthony Powell's novels so many times now, listened to the audiobook so many times, that the rhythms of his voice, his style, his careful, measured prose, classical, elegant, sometimes baroque, but always very vivid and insightful and clear. That style really informs the way I write. Emphasis on scenes, on characters, descriptions, and dialogue, but with enough interior reflections at key moments to provide the books with a thematic weight. I really value that in Powell's books, and I try and bring that to my own in whatever I write. So even though the subject matter is not like Powell and the setting is not like Powell, I like to think the sensibilities are similar and something in the style is similar. All right, so let's dive into The Acceptance World, the third book. Now, unlike the previous two podcasts that I've done so far on Powell, in which I analyzed A Buyer's Market, the second book, and A Question of Upbringing, the first book, in those two, I really went chronologically through the books because both of those books were structured in a slightly more straightforward way. Book one was structured around following Nick in these different worlds and the different people that he encounters, and in particular the evolution, as I said, of his childhood friendship with Charles Stringham and Peter Templar, both of whom recur in this novel. Book two, meanwhile, was structured around Nick's quest for romantic fulfillment as he moves from Barbara to Gypsy Jones. Book three is a little looser in its structure, and what I mean by that is there is not necessarily one particular clear through line that dominates the book, as with the first two. Instead, what we have is a series of different threads, different storylines that I think you can metaphorically think of as different threads that interweave to create this particular pattern, and then all of which conclude in the final chapter. And this is also what you'll see as we move forward. This is the type of structure Powell is going to imply in many of his future novels as well. The novels become a little more diffuse. They become less concentrated on Nick's experiences. And so I think the best analysis for this one, instead of going chronologically, is to look at each of these different threads and look at each of the different thematic ideas that Powell is layering into this novel and kind of discuss them all separately. So unlike previous podcasts here, we're going to jump around a little bit more. And as I discuss different scenes, we're not necessarily going to go in chronological order because I think it's more revealing to look at this novel as a series of parallel storylines that have thematic connections. So taking a more thematic approach rather than a chronological structured approach, I think is better for this book. Now, the most important theme that I want to start with is, of course, the title, The Acceptance World. It's a wonderful title. It's very evocative. And even without knowing what the title refers to, because we learn what the title refers to in the middle of chapter 2, when Nick has a conversation with his friend Peter about the acceptance world. But even before we learn what this title refers to, I think the phrase conjures up certain ideas. This idea of acceptance. This is a novel in which a lot of characters have to accept certain realities about life and about adulthood and about circumstance. And for Nick, acceptance is an important thematic idea throughout this entire novel. Acceptance of life's circumstances. So even before we understand the financial metaphor that the phrase the acceptance world refers to, even before we understand that, the phrase is evocative of a certain emotional transformation, a movement towards acceptance, which I think for Nick, as we're going to see in this novel, is what it means to become an adult. And the key age, I think, that a lot of the characters are in this novel is around 30. There's even a passage, in which we're going to quote in a moment, where Nick pretty explicitly indicates the idea of being 30 as being akin to entering the acceptance world. It's a threshold of adulthood that Nick recognizes as significant. And we're going to talk about how and why, and what he learns by crossing this threshold. That is how a lot of these novels are structured. These key moments in Nick's life in which he recognizes that there is a shift, that there is a change in some way. There is some movement of significance. So let's start, though, with the phrase, the acceptance world. And let's look at the scene in Chapter 2 in which Peter Templar, first explains this phrase, first uses this phrase and explains it to Nick. So this moment occurs in Chapter 2, around page 45 in my version. So this is the scene where Nick is going to the Ritz to meet Mark members to discuss, one of the plot lines here is that St. John Clark, St. John Clark, a famous author, is meant to write an introduction for a book that Nick's firm is putting out about the art of Horace Isbister, who is this conventional portrait painter of the age. We're going to talk more about this plot line and the sort of commentary and thematic commentary on art that runs throughout this book. But as I said, that's a separate thread that I'll look at towards the end of our podcast. Instead, all we need to know is that Nick happens to be at this place, and this is the context of him running into Templar. And he and Templar start discussing Widmerpool. So in this novel, Widmerpool is less present than he was in the other novel that we read, in The Buyer's Market, and he's less present than he's going to be in the future. But it's important, of course, that Widmerpool is connected to the primary metaphor that gives the book its title, the acceptance world. So Peter Templar says, Widmerpool is joining the acceptance world. But what is the acceptance world? So this is the key question. Nick asks the question, and now Templar is going to explain. If you have goods you want to sell to a firm in Bolivia, you probably do not touch your money in the ordinary way until the stuff arrives there. Certain houses, therefore, are prepared to accept the debt. They will advance you the money on the strength of your reputation. It is all right when the going is good, but sooner or later you are tempted to plunge. Then there is an alteration in the value of the Bolivian exchange, or a revolution, or perhaps the firm just goes bust, and you find yourself stung. That is, if you guess wrong. So that's kind of a pretty complicated financial metaphor, the acceptance world. The idea is there is a group of firms who accept your debt, right? If you're trying to sell goods somewhere, you're not going to see the money. You're not going to get paid until the goods arrive. And so a firm is basically going to lend you the money. They will accept your debt. They will lend you the money on the strength of your reputation. That's a key phrase. And the idea is this is all good, but let's say something goes wrong. The goods don't arrive in Bolivia. The currency shifts. Something changes. Then suddenly you can no longer pay off your debt to the acceptance world. You lose money, basically. So the idea of the acceptance world is, I believe, is the idea of risk. Essentially what Templar is describing here is a kind of risk you take in the world of finance when you are trying to sell something for money. there is some risk involved when you accept the money in advance from one of these houses with the promise that you will pay them later. And the point is, you can make money, but you might also lose money. You might get stung, as he says. And this is a metaphor for a lot of characters and what they experience. I think what's important here is this applies to life more generally, but specifically it applies for a lot of these characters to marriage. So one of the other storylines, themes, running sort of threads through this book is the story of Templar's own marriage to Mona. So we learn that Templar is now married to Mona, who was formerly an artist's model. And this is the story that takes up the majority, a large section of the book, where Mona essentially runs off with Quiggin, J.G. Quiggin, a Marxist writer whom we met in an earlier book, whom we met back in the first book, A Question of Upbringing, someone Nick knew from Oxford, from college. And so in a way, if you think about it, right, Templar, by marrying Mona, took a risk and then was stung when Mona left him, was stung and lost. A lot of characters take risks in romance, take risks when it comes to marriage, and lose in this book. The book opens, actually, with Uncle Giles, who we're going to talk about some more. Uncle Giles, who is, for Nick, always the representation of the adult world, someone he always talks about as one of the first adults, aside from his parents, whom he interacted with and met and got to know. It seems like Uncle Giles is going to marry this woman named Myra Erdley, Mrs. Erdley, this kind of mystical fortune teller character associated with the occult, the world of divination. He is also stung. As we learn, Mrs. Erdley does not marry him and, in fact, goes off with a younger man named Jimmy Stripling, one of Nick's friends. We're going to talk more about this and what it says about adult relationships and what it means to enter the adult world. But the point here is that Uncle Giles, much like Templar, is also stung by the acceptance world. He takes a risk in the context of marriage and is stung. Barnaby is another character who risks something by attempting to pursue a woman named Anne Stepney. He is also stung at the end. It's a minor plotline, a more minor character, a minor key variation of the Templar storyline, which is the main one. But Barnaby also loses Anne to Dickie Umfreville, another character, who essentially steals her from Barnaby, so to speak, to put it kind of bluntly. Nick, too. Nick ends up, the primary storyline that Nick experiences in this is he starts an affair with Jean Templar, with Templar's sister, with Peter's sister. And we've seen earlier in previous books how Nick has been interested in Jean, and here he essentially consummates this desire that's been brewing in him. And it's not a marriage, but in some ways it is, and it has the same function as Templar's relationship with Mona. Nick is also stung in some ways by the end, not because Jean leaves him, but because through his relationship with Jean, he learns something about the complexity of human relationships and the simple romanticism of his union with Jean kind of fades a little bit by the end. And we're going to look at the ending scene and look at what it suggests. And if you've read future books, you know, obviously, that Nick and Jean do not stay together. We also can detect that at the end of this book. There's this implication at the end that their romance, that their affair is temporary, and that it is going to end soon when Jean's husband returns from abroad. And so Nick is also a character who is stung in some ways by taking a risk. So in many of these cases, right, we can see the metaphor of the acceptance world applying to lots of different characters in lots of different situations here. But, of course, there is a moment where Nick pretty explicitly draws this connection for us. It is not simply something we need to kind of intuit. So let's look at the beginning of chapter 5. So like I said, we're jumping around in this podcast rather than going chronologically because I want to pick out these different themes and take a thematic approach. So at the beginning of chapter 5, Nick returns to the metaphor of the acceptance world and pretty explicitly draws the connection that I just drew, the connection to human life and human relationships and human affairs. So let's look at the beginning of chapter 5. When, in describing Widmerpool's new employment, Templar had spoken of the acceptance world, I had been struck by the phrase. Even as a technical definition, it seemed to suggest what we are all doing, not only in business, but in love, art, religion, philosophy, politics, in fact, all human activities. The acceptance world was the world in which the essential element, happiness, for example, is drawn, as it were, from an engagement to meet a bill. Sometimes the goods are delivered, even a small profit made. Sometimes the goods are not delivered, and disaster follows. Sometimes the goods are delivered, but the value of the currency is changed. Besides, in another sense, the whole world is the acceptance world as one approaches 30. At least some illusions discarded. The mere fact of still existing as a human being proved that. So this is one of my favorite passages in this novel. I think it's the key to the whole novel. And let's look at, because he makes it pretty explicit, right? I spoke earlier about how a lot of characters suffer the sting of the acceptance world in the context of love. But as Nick says here, it applies to all fields of life. Art, religion, philosophy, politics. You know, the other big storyline that's kind of the more comedic storyline in the background of this novel is the rivalry between Mark Members and J.G. Quiggin, and then later Guggenbuhl, the German student, over who is going to be the secretary to St. John Clarke, this elderly, aging, old-fashioned novelist. And each of these young men are trying to convert St. John Clarke to different modern philosophies. Mark Members is more of a Freudian psychoanalyst. He's interested in those ideas. Quiggin is a Marxist materialist. And then Guggenbuhl later is a Trotskyist, as Quiggin says derisively. The point is that's kind of a comedic version of the same thing as something like Templar's relationship with Mona. It is a risk that each of the characters takes, sometimes pays off, sometimes does not. The way Nick puts it here, though, is really well said. The essential element, happiness, for example, is drawn, as it were, from an engagement to meet a bill. So he sort of says, like, this is how we all approach life. We might think, oh, you do something and you get happiness in exchange. And he says, no. Instead, the way life works is you draw happiness as if you are borrowing money from one of those houses that lend you money, that accept the debt, right? It's like borrowing something from the acceptance world. You are borrowing happiness, but you have a requirement, right, to meet the bill later. Imagine that metaphor Templar used, right, delivering the goods to Bolivia. If the goods arrive, you might make a profit. You pay off your debt in happiness, you've made a profit in happiness, in money, but implicitly in happiness. Sometimes the goods are not delivered, and disaster follows, he says, meaning sometimes the goods don't reach Bolivia. You've taken out this debt of happiness, you lose it. You lose happiness, right? You have to kind of pay off your debt, and you do not make a profit in happiness, you have lost in happiness. That is essentially what happens to Templar with Mona. He cannot deliver the goods, so to speak. He cannot be the husband she needs, and eventually she leaves him and returns to the sort of artistic roots, right? She was an artist's model, and under Templar's influence, she became more conventional. She started doing advertisements, but she always had that interest in the artistic world. And along comes Quiggin, the Marxist artist intellectual, the poet, and sort of unexpectedly sweeps Mona off her feet, and then she leaves Templar for him. And so that's an example of where the goods are not delivered, and disaster follows. So Templar loses his wife. There are other characters, of course, for whom, right, they have to pay back the happiness, so to speak, and end up having lost rather than made a profit. The last part of the metaphor, though, is interesting, where Nick says, and sometimes the goods are delivered, but the value of the currency is changed. I believe this is a subtle reference to himself and his relationship to Jean. So in his relationship to Jean, he does, in fact, they are together. She does not leave him like Mona leaves Templar or like Anne leaves Barnaby. She stays with him. And implicitly, of course, they're not going to stay together because Bob is coming back, right? Jean's husband is coming back. But the key phrase there, the value of the currency is changed. Nick's feelings towards Jean change over the course of the novel. It's very subtle, but he begins the novel with a highly romantic view of Jean. And we're going to look at the scene where they first get together in the car as they're driving to Peter and Mona's house. That's a very romantically written scene. Later, Nick faces a sort of almost like shock of realism to some extent. He realized, he and Jean have a fight at one point. He learned specifically that she had an affair earlier with another character, with Jimmy Stripling. And this leads him to question Jean's value, to put it in the ugly metaphor of currency. He sort of wonders, well, if Jean saw something in Jimmy, who is kind of a joke of a character, Jimmy Stripling, Nick starts to question, what does she see in me? Does she think I'm similar to Jimmy Stripling? And it leads him to kind of question his own infatuation and to question her to some extent. In other words, the value of the currency is changed. He sees Jean differently. As currency, she is no longer the same as what she was. So he gets the happiness, he gets the goods delivered, but the value of the currency changes. And so as a result, he doesn't feel like he's made a profit on happiness, even though the goods were delivered, so to speak. So again, that this passage and that metaphor of the acceptance world, it's such a brilliant way of using pretty complex financial metaphor to say something about human happiness. I think only a writer with Powell's patience and insightfulness could pull off something like this. It makes sense, of course, for the world as well, because in this case, Templar in this novel is a major character, and Templar is a man of the city, a man who is in finance. And so it makes sense for this financial metaphor to be the central metaphor of this book. By the end of this passage, Nick, of course, also just essentially says it, right? The acceptance world is essentially the whole world as one approaches 30. The point he's making is that as you approach 30, this metaphor applies more and more to every part of your life. You draw happiness from a bank, so to speak. You draw the element of happiness and you have to pay it back in some way. Maybe you make a profit, maybe you lose. As he puts it, illusions become discarded, at least some illusions discarded. What is he talking about? He's talking about his illusions with Jean, which are some of the illusions that are discarded. And we're going to see in this very brilliant passage at the end where he reflects on a postcard that Jean sends him, where he reflects on this postcard as a way of reflecting on his own changing feelings towards her and his own feelings towards the world more generally. But before we do that, I want to pick at another theme. So besides the acceptance world, which is, of course, the main metaphor that is used throughout the novel. And you can see why I wanted to read these passages first, because this metaphor only becomes clear in chapter 5 when we read this passage from Nick. There's only 5 chapters in this book, so this is the last chapter. This metaphor only becomes clear in this 5th chapter. The other thread that I want to look at is there is this amusing contrast between 2 different worldviews presented in this novel. On the one hand, we have the world of mysticism and the occult, as embodied by the character of the fortune teller, Mrs. Erdley, who Nick meets in the 1st chapter when he visits Uncle Giles. She tells his fortune. She basically predicts that he will have this romance with Jean, essentially. And then the other contrasting worldview is the worldview of Quiggin, the Marxist. The idea that the world is not governed by these occult forces beyond our perception, but by material things. And these 2 worldviews have their most direct clash in a very funny scene that is essentially in the middle of the novel, in chapter 3, where both Quiggin and Mrs. Erdley are present in the Templar's house for an afternoon, for a lunch, and they play with something called planchette, which is kind of an old-fashioned version of a Ouija board, essentially. In America, I believe we would call it a Ouija board. These, planchette, these things were very popular at the turn of the century. There was a lot of interest in mysticism and the occult around this time, and that's kind of what Powell is tapping into and making fun of. In this particular case, they try and use it in a kind of mock seance in this afternoon, and they try and get the spirits to speak to them. And it's a very funny scene because the spirit that speaks to them is the spirit of Karl Marx. Basically, the planchette, the Ouija board, starts writing phrases from the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. And Quiggin, the materialist, the Marxist, recognizes this and gets really upset because he doesn't like the idea. He feels that someone is making fun of him. Because Quiggin, of course, does not believe in any of that, mumbo-jumbo, right? Believe in any of the occult stuff. He believes in material things. He believes in class struggle. He is a Marxist. And so what is Powell's point, though? Overall, because I don't think he's simply making fun of Quiggin. I don't think he's endorsing one worldview over the other. He's asking this question, what really governs the world? Is it unseen forces, occult forces, or is it simply material things? And Powell does not answer this. Powell is not interested in answering this. He does not believe one is right and one is wrong. Instead, he presents these two worldviews as diametrically opposed and conflicting with one another, and yet both clearly in vogue at the time and kind of governing the characters and governing the world. He almost presents both worldviews as having some justification. The planchette scene really does seem to, he never provides an answer as to, someone was secretly writing those messages. He never answers who was writing those messages. The scene essentially ends with all the characters left wondering, was it really an occult phenomenon? Was it really a visitation? Powell does not answer that question. Most of the novel is set in a realist mode, so we have to imagine, he doesn't really indulge in too much occult stuff in this novel. There's not a lot of, there's no speculative element, so we have to assume there is a logical explanation, but Powell does not provide that logical explanation. He lets Mrs. Erdely's worldview of occult forces, he lets it remain possible. And of course, Mrs. Erdely also rightly predicted Nick's own future, his future romance with Jean, when she did a tarot reading of him in the first chapter. At the same time, Quiggin is not just the butt of jokes in this novel. His materialist Marxist worldview is also presented as victorious in this novel. Quiggin wins, basically. First, he kind of defeats Mark for competition over influencing St. John Clarke. He successfully turned St. John Clarke into a Marxist, and in the fourth chapter, the kind of big comedic moment is when Nick and Mark members see Quiggin and Mona essentially wheeling St. John Clarke through this protest, left-wing protest moving through the park. So Quiggin not only successfully converts St. John Clarke to Marxism, he also, of course, wins Mona. And so Quiggin's material worldview, his belief in material forces, they are also presented as correct in some ways. They do also help him succeed. Quiggin wins in this novel, if you want to put it so bluntly. So Powell presents these two worldviews. He doesn't really address which one is correct and which one is not. Instead, he sort of just presents them both as potential, as possible. And he sort of leaves it up in the air. I think the conclusion we could draw, why does Powell choose these two? Think about the larger question that we've been looking at in a lot of these novels, including the previous novel, Buyer's Market especially. There was this question of will versus circumstance. What governs the world? Is it accident/fate, or is it will? Some of the characters like Quiggin, and of course Widmerpool, represent the will, represent a sort of interest in the material world, material directness. They exert their will upon the world and they succeed. Nick obviously does not feel that way. He seems to believe that the world is governed by accident, fate, and circumstance. And so I think by introducing Mrs. Erdely and introducing this dimension of the occult and of fortune-telling and of mysticism into the novel, Powell is suggesting, he's saying it's you can take it beyond simply circumstance and accident. You can think of it as fate. Was Nick fated to meet Jean? If we really break it down, how did Nick end up having this affair with Jean? Well, he happened to be at the Ritz to meet Mark members who happened not to show up. Peter Templar happened to show up and meet him. Jean happened to be with him. So the whole thing was an accident. If Nick hadn't been there, if Nick hadn't waited, if he hadn't met Peter, his affair with Jean would not have started. And so from Nick's perspective, in some ways you could think of it as an accident or circumstance. But because we started this novel with Miss Erdley, we also need to think of it as fate. Was it fate that Nick met Jean in this context? There are a lot of moments where accidental meetings between characters leads to shifts in characters' lives. The other scene, which we'll look at later, is, of course, when they go to Fappa's, when they go to the bar. And again, it's all coincidental. Nick happens to run into Barnaby and Anne Stepney. They happen to run into Dickie Umfreville, who's a wonderful character. Who we're gonna look at that scene because I love Dickie Umfreville. Fantastic character, one of my favorite minor characters in the whole series. And this is, of course, what leads to Dickie and Anne meeting, and then implicitly, this is the beginning of their love affair and the moment when he takes her from Barnaby. So if it hadn't been for this accident, right, Barnaby and Anne Stepney's relationship might not have broken down. So there are a lot of instances of accident that happen to lead to situations. There's a lot more we could talk about, and that's a theme that runs through this whole book. But I just think it's a great little moment where Powell uses two worldviews popular at the time to introduce, again, this question of fate versus will. The recurring, I believe, thematic conflict and thematic tension throughout the entire series of novels. Now, I want to look specifically now, though, at the scene where Nick begins his affair with Jean. Partly because one of the things, as I want to trace, is the evolution of Nick's feelings. So, chapter 2, towards the end, in my version, it's on page 64, 63. Jean and I sat at the back of the car. We passed through Hammersmith and the neighborhood of Chiswick, then out onto the Great West Road. For a time, I made desultory conversation. At last, she scarcely answered, and I gave it up. Templar, smoking a cigar in the front, also seemed disinclined to talk now that he was at the wheel. We drove along at a good rate. On either side of the highway, grotesque buildings, which in daytime resembled the temples of some shoddy, utterly unsympathetic Atlantis, now assumed the appearance of an Arctic city's frontier forts. Veiled in snow, these hideous monuments of a lost world bordered a broad river of black, foaming slush, across the surface of which the car skimmed and jolted with a harsh crackling sound, as if the liquid beneath were scalding hot. So, what is he talking about here? Such a bizarre passage to emphasize this transition. He's describing the buildings on either side of the highway, and he emphasizes how grotesque they are. They look like ruined temples from, as he calls it, a shoddy, utterly unsympathetic Atlantis. And they now seemed like an Arctic city's frontier forts. He has this really interesting description where it's wintertime, it's snowing, right? But he imagined these ugly buildings along the side of the road like frontier forts. So he's using this description to say, as the car is moving, it's crossing a threshold of sorts. This whole paragraph is a description of a series of thresholds, different ways of describing a threshold. Why? Because this is the threshold that Nick is about to cross as he begins his romance with Jean. And he even describes it as a river of black foaming slush, and the car is skimming as if the liquid beneath is scalding hot. I mean, I think it makes me think of descriptions of the underworld in some way, one of the black rivers of the underworld. It's an interestingly negative, dark description to describe something that should be a monumentous and positive moment in Nick's life, right? He is about to get with Jean. He is about to consummate this desire that he's felt for a long time. And yet right before he does that, it's as if he is crossing some Arctic threshold. Either, there's two different metaphors operating here. There's the Arctic, the snow in the north, cold, Arctic forts. And then there's almost this hellish river in the underworld, a river of black foaming slush, as if the liquid is scalding hot, right? He has these kind of warring metaphors here, these dual metaphors of hot and cold. I think it's there to, on the one hand, convey this implied emotional turbulence that he's feeling, both hot and cold. There's this sense of things in flux. Also, varying kind of borders and thresholds that he's crossing. But I think he's also setting up implicitly the idea that this is not going to be a purely positive moment, threshold. As we're going to see, through this romance with Jean, he is going to enter the acceptance world. He is going to learn what it means to be an adult, to make compromises, to take risks and lose, and to understand kind of reality in a different way than he did before. We're going to see that as we get to the end. But I think Powell sets it up here with this pretty complex and unexpectedly dark image of the threshold that Nick is crossing here, that the car is crossing. Now look at the next paragraph. Although not always simultaneous in taking effect, nor necessarily at all equal in voltage, the process of love is rarely unilateral. When the moment comes, a secret attachment is often returned with interest. Some know this by instinct. Others learn in a hard school. So he immediately starts talking about love. As soon as he talks about crossing this black river, right, this scalding liquid, passing these Arctic forts, he starts talking about love. So he wants us to understand that these images of thresholds that he's describing are connected to the idea of love, the threshold of love. Continuing on, the exact spot must have been a few hundred yards beyond the point where the electrically illuminated young lady in a bathing dress dives eternally through the petrol-tainted air, night and day, winter and summer, never reaching the water of the pool to which she endlessly glides. Like some image of arrested development, she returns forever, voluntarily, to the springboard from which she started her leap. A few seconds after I had seen this bathing belle journeying, as usual, imperturbably through the frozen air, I took Jean in my arms. What a magnificent paragraph. First of all, only Powell would write the beginning of a romance in such a way. Because what does Nick connect his romance to? Even the actual sentence structure is connected syntactically to this image. He sees this image of an electrically illuminated young lady in a bathing dress. Now, we have to imagine this is some neon sign, some sort of advertisement. We don't know for what. Perhaps readers from the 1920s or someone who is an aficionado of the time might recognize what this is meant to be an advertisement for or a symbol of. This is important because the ending, we're going to get to the ending. In the ending, Nick also looks at a piece of artwork, essentially, on a postcard at the end, a young woman and a man who are meant to represent love. And he sort of critiques the artwork before accepting it as an image of his world. There is a whole thread throughout this, which we're going to visit toward the end of our podcast here, about art and art criticism in the context of the artist Horace Isbister, who is another through line in this novel. This right here is another example of art, right? It's essentially a kind of public art you could think of, an advertisement. A young lady in a bathing dress diving through the petrol-tainted air. And he emphasizes that she does this endlessly. She is always diving, never reaching the water, right? There is no pool because you imagine as soon as she reaches the bottom, the neon comes back and starts again. It's this constantly diving, kind of flashing neon sign of this girl diving. And he even says it's an image of arrested development. She starts her leap and keeps going. She starts her leap and keeps going. Why do we think Powell chooses this as an image to indicate the beginning of Nick's relationship to Jean? Again, much like that description of the lava threshold of the river, it's not a very positive image, is it? It suggests arrested development. It suggests beginning without consummation. She dives, but she never reaches the pool. Is this meant to be foreshadowing of Nick's own emotional journey? I think in some ways, yes. Because like the girl in the dress, like the diving girl, he is about to dive. He is about to leap into this pool that is a love affair with Jean. He is the one taking Jean in his arms. And it's even linked in the very same sentence. A few seconds after I had seen this bathing belle journeying as usual, imperturbably through the frozen air, I took Jean in my arms. Syntactically, he's connected. Nick is connected to the bathing bell in the advertisement. He is taking this risk. Remember, risk. The acceptance world is all about risk. But of course, the difference between reality and, in this case, you could call it art or advertising or images, reality and images. In the image, the girl is always going to be in this state of arrested development. She never actually has to reach the water. She's never going to reach the water. There is no water for her to reach. She is always going to be diving. As it says, night and day, winter and summer, never reaching the water of the pool to which she endlessly glides. But Nick is not like the girl because he lives in the real world, a world where night does become day, where winter does become summer, where the seasons move. And so, for Nick, there is a pool. There is a consummation. There is an ending. And that's what he learns over the course of this novel. He begins the romance looking at this image of the diving girl, but that is not going to be the image that he concludes with. He is not going to be in this state of arrested development. His relationship with Jean will transform him, transform her, transform them. It will not be as romantic as it is when he first begins it. And again, it's just a testament to how wonderful a writer Powell is that he's able to do something like this, that he takes a specific image, like the diving girl, and associates it with a moment and an emotion. It's just a wonderful example of how symbolism can work in novels. I think it's very similar to there's a much more famous example of something just like this in The Great Gatsby, where Fitzgerald writes about Nick Carraway, seeing this image of the eyes of T.J. Eckleburg, right? This advertisement of this optometrist, and they become this symbol throughout the whole novel. In that particular case, I mean, to be fair, I think in The Great Gatsby, it's a pretty heavy-handed image, pretty heavy-handed metaphor that he returns to. I think what's nice about the way Powell does it here is it's more subtle. We're only going to see this diving girl once. We're never going to see her again. This is it. But the image works because we associate this strong emotion and this strong feeling with it. Now look at the next paragraph. Her response, so sudden and passionate, seemed surprising only a minute or two later. All at once, everything was changed. Her body felt at the same time hard and yielding, giving a kind of glow, as if live current issued from it. I used to wonder afterwards whether, in the last resort, of all the time we spent together, however ecstatic, those first moments on the Great West Road were not the best. So already at the beginning of their romance, Powell already has Nick think of the end, reflect on the end, and very sadly kind of think that this was the best moment. This was going to be the best moment, this beginning. I mean, it's such a tragic way of introducing a love story to essentially say it's only going to go downhill from here. It's only going to get worse for these two characters. This moment between them here is the best. They will never reach these types of ecstatic heights again. But of course, that is the acceptance world. The risk you take, and sometimes, as he said, the currency, the value of the currency changes, and the happiness that you extracted from the bank, you pay it back, and you don't make a profit, but you make a loss. And that's metaphorically what happens to Nick here. So then, let's look at a few more scenes, a few more moments from this book before we get to the end. Because I do want to eventually get to the end of Nick's love story at the very end, but I think there's a few more threads that I want to touch on before we get to the end. So one of the other threads that I think is very interesting is, the acceptance world. When Nick uses that metaphor, he talks a lot about turning 30. That's the kind of age that he identifies as entering the acceptance world. One of the themes that we see in this novel is the fluidity between the adult world and Nick's world, the world of people Nick's age. As they enter the acceptance world, as they become 30, they are now adults. And as a result, one of the things Nick learns in this novel is that adults are not a station above him anymore. Now that he has become an adult himself, now that he has entered the acceptance world, he and all the other adults in his life, formerly who he looked up to, are now on an equal level playing field. They are all on the same playing field. And one of the themes we see in this novel is the fluidity between people of different ages, this sort of generational fluidity. We see this generational fluidity with Mrs. Erdley, of course. It begins with her potentially marrying Uncle Giles, and then later we learn that she's actually in a relationship with Jimmy Stripling, who is someone around Nick's age, of his generation, someone younger. So we see this sort of imbalance, so to speak, in terms of ages. And what Nick sort of realizes is that, Uncle Giles and Mrs. Erdley are not adults a station above him, that they are, in fact, now all adults. Jimmy Stripling, of course, he learns, also was in a relationship with Jean at one point. Something that's the big secret that disturbs Nick so much, the big secret that changes the currency, so to speak. The other adult, though, that we meet, who represents this generational fluidity, is Dickie Umfreville, one of my favorite characters, as I said earlier. So let's look at the introduction of Dickie Umfreville, and we'll just kind of comment upon the way Powell uses him. He's a great example of how supporting characters can be used effectively in novels. He will pop up occasionally, and as I say in my creative writing classes, supporting characters should be, functional for the plot of the novel, obviously, but they should also be symbolic or representational. They should be thematically significant. You don't just introduce a supporting character randomly. They need to have some sort of thematic function for what you're trying to say. And Umfreville, clearly does. So let's look at the scene where Umfreville is introduced. So this is in chapter 4, towards the end, when they go to Foppa's. So first, let's look at around page 150. This is the physical description of Umfreville. Looking at him more closely, as he had said this, I was surprised that he had remained almost unobserved until that moment. He was no ordinary person. That was clear. Of medium height, even rather small when not compared with Foppa, he was slim, with that indefinably horsey look that seems even to affect the texture of the skin. His age was hard to guess. Probably he was in his 40s. That's important, by the way, because as we're going to see, one of the things that Nick learns now as he enters the adult world is that you no longer have these clear delineations of rank, so to speak, based on age. Everyone is now an adult. Everyone in some ways is equal. He does this a lot whenever he describes characters' personal appearances. Later, there's going to be a scene in which he has a kind of reunion, basically, with his school and his schoolmaster. This is another important moment when we see adulthood for Nick becomes this moment when the gradations of school disappear. As he says in that scene, that later scene, a lot of the people from his class, it was hard to tell who was of what generation. Some of them had aged faster than others. Some of them had grown bald faster than others. Time was kinder to some of them compared to others. Nick really emphasizes this a lot. And as a result, as people enter adulthood, as people enter the acceptance world, when people become 30 and older, they all start to blend together. And there's a lot of jokes made that Lebas, their housemaster, has trouble differentiating them generation by generation. He will mix up people who are 15 years apart in age. But I think that's Powell's point, that when you become an adult, when you enter the acceptance world, those gradations of childhood and youth no longer matter. Now, adults are adults, whether you are 40 or 60 or 30. You are all adults now. You are all on the same plane and in the same world. Symbolically, I think that final scene, which we're not going to look at, but that final scene where Lebas is giving his speech and he has a stroke, I mean, that's a very obvious symbolic movement out of childhood, out of school. The authority figure of Nick and Stringham and Widmerpool and Templar's school days has a stroke at a reunion dinner, and they have to take care of him. I mean, it can't get more symbolic than that. Can't get clearer than that. That is a moment when the adults and the former children, the former students, the adults and the former students are now on the same plane. They are on the same level. They are all part of the acceptance world. But coming back to Dickie Umfreville, if we keep reading, He was very trim in his clothes. They were old, neat, well-preserved clothes, a little like those worn by Uncle Giles. This man gave the impression of having handled large sums of money in his time, although he did not convey any presumption of affluence at that particular moment. He was clean-shaven and wore a hard collar and brigade of guards tie. I could not imagine what someone of that sort was doing at Foppa's. There was something about him of Buster Fox, third husband of Stringham's mother, the same cool, tough, socially elegant personality, though far more genial than Buster's. He lacked, too, that carapace of professional egotism acquired in boyhood that envelops protectively even the most good-humored naval officer. Perhaps the similarity to Buster was, after all, only the outer veneer acquired by all people of the same generation. So what I think is important here is, he emphasizes Dickie's appearance, but he emphasizes Dickie's appearance in order to say it's hard to tell exactly how old he is, and Nick basically wants to understand who Dickie is from his external attributes, from his clothes and from his appearance. He wants to make a judgment and to kind of easily categorize Dickie, as he often does with people, right? Nick is very good at, when he meets people, at categorizing them, at drawing conclusions from exterior details. And with Dickie, it's hard. As he says, it's hard to really place him. He tries to make certain comparisons. He says he's like Uncle Giles, who is another, of course, adult figure in Nick's world, and he's like Buster Fox, who is Stringham's father-in-law. But he ends by saying, actually, the resemblance to Buster Fox is really just physical in some ways. It's really just as he describes it, an outer veneer acquired by all people of the same generation. The point is the contrast between the outer veneer and the inner personality, right? Even though Dickie Umfreville is of this older generation, it's just an outer veneer, Nick realizes. That actually, Umfreville is this kind of fluid man who moves between generations. And the most obvious way we're going to see this is that by the end of this novel, he's going to marry Anne Stepney, who is significantly younger than him, who is Nick's age and who is Barnby, one of Nick's friends, who is Barnby's love interest. And the fact that Umfreville swoops in and takes her and marries her suggests, I think, one of Powell's points is that generations no longer matter when you enter the adult world. A man in his 40s, like Dickie Umfreville, might have the spirit of a much younger man, which, as we see, he is going to have. If we jump ahead, another paragraph that I think is really important about Dickie Umfreville. So Nick has this really interesting revelation as he studies him. There was something, so this is a few pages later on page 152. There was something else about Umfreville that struck me, a characteristic I had noticed in other people of his age. He seemed still young, a person like oneself. Again, Powell says it pretty openly and clearly. Dickie seemed young, even though he was in an older generation. And yet, at the same time, his appearance and manner proclaimed that he had had time to live at least a few years of his grown-up life before the outbreak of war in 1914. Once I had thought of those who had known the epoch of my own childhood as older people. Then I had found there existed people like Umfreville who seemed somehow to span the gap. They partook of both eras, specially forming the tone of the post-war years, much more so, indeed, than the younger people. Most of them, like Umfreville, were melancholy, perhaps from the strain of living simultaneously in two different historical periods. That was his category, certainly. So, what is important there? I mean, I really like this passage because Nick is, on the one hand, he's emphasizing that Umfreville is this kind of generationally fluid person. But he even returns to that theme that I've been touching on about adults and older people. That once Nick had thought these people were older people. That's the phrase he uses. Then he realizes that actually they kind of exist in both generations. They, as he says, span the gap. What is the gap? The gap is, of course, World War I. World War I, Nick was too young to obviously fight in it. He was a child, but it's the big event of his childhood. And for him, World War I was this break, basically. right? People who had grown up and lived portions of their lives before World War I seemed consciously different in some ways than people who lived after. The idea, what Umfreville does for Nick is he complicates his idea of these clearly delineated historical eras, that you can't just simply divide people between people who grew up before World War I and people who grew up after, that there are people who, quote unquote, span the gap. This, I think, is a preview of what's to come, because in many ways, Nick himself is going to be someone who spans another gap, which is, of course, World War II. He is going to be a person who grew up before World War II, served in World War II, and then grew up and then continued to live his life after World War II. So in some ways, I think Umfreville is kind of this interesting foreshadowing or preview of someone who Nick is going to be like, someone who, look at what he says about Umfreville. He's melancholy from the strain of living in two different historical periods. I mean, doesn't that just describe Nick as a whole in this entire book series? He feels melancholy because he is witness to this profound historical change. He feels as though he's living in multiple historical eras. Overall, though, I think the point of Umfreville and the point of this whole scene, and the reason, what's interesting is Nick spends a lot of time on Umfreville. Powell spends a lot of time describing Umfreville, more so than he does other minor characters. Why is that? For a character who really only has one function in this novel, to kind of show up, he takes them to a party, he kind of represents this older kind of celebratory spirit, this older spirit of merrymaking that he feels has gone away from the world, this older spirit of pleasure-seeking that he feels young people no longer have. There's this funny moment where he complained that people today only talk about international relations in serious ways. They no longer like to have fun. And then later when we see Widmerpool in the final chapter, the first thing we see him do is he's talking about international relations. And so I think Umfreville's comment is meant to be this comment on people like Widmerpool. An amusing little comment, but the larger point is Umfreville's function in the story is pretty small, right? And then, of course, we later learn that he marries Anne Stepney. But I think thematically, symbolically, he has a much more significant function. He represents, for Nick and for Powell, the fluidity of adults, right? This generational fluidity. That is one of the big lessons Nick learns as he enters the acceptance world. Okay, now the final thread that I want to look at, the final little thread that I want to tease out, is the thread about art. There is a whole subplot, you could say, thematic kind of undercurrent about artistic forms in this novel. One of the earliest plot lines that's introduced is there's this artist named Horace Isbister, a conventional kind of portrait artist of the early 20th century, who dies, right? And Nick's firm is putting out a book to celebrate his life, The Art of Horace Isbister. And he wants St. John Clarke, this famous author, to write an introduction. And the humor of it is that because St. John Clarke has now converted to modernism and Marxism under the influence of Mark Members and Quiggin, he is no longer interested in an old-fashioned conventional artist like Horace Isbister, and ultimately he never writes the introduction. It's kind of just a minor comedic conflict, kind of in the background of the more serious stuff at the forefront of the novel. But it does lead to these interesting discussions, conversations, and reflections about art. And I believe the final scene, which we're going to look at, in which Nick reflects on this postcard that Jean sends him, kind of combines this artistic thread with Nick's own emotionally turbulent journey via his love affair with Jean, in the context of his love affair with Jean. So let's look at a few different moments. I want to start with, there's a funny little line where Nick, in chapter 1, Nick and Barnaby are discussing St. John Clarke. They're discussing St. John Clarke, and they're discussing kind of modernism and these trends in art. So this is on page 24 in chapter 1. They're talking about the introduction that St. John Clarke wants to write about Isbister. "You'll never get that introduction now," Barnaby said, after listening to my story. "St. John Clarke in these days would think poor old Isbister much too pompier. But they are still great friends. What does that matter? Besides, St. John Clarke doesn't know a Van Dyck from a Van Dongen." "Ah, but he does by now," said Barnaby. "That's where you are wrong. You are out of date. St. John Clarke has undergone a conversion." "To what?" "Modernism. Steel chairs? No doubt they will come. pictures made of shells and newspaper. At present, he is at a slightly earlier stage. So it's a bit of a joke, right? It's kind of, Barnby is meant to be a modern painter. They're making fun of this old-fashioned author who has converted to modernism. And Nick makes a little joke about steel chairs and pictures made of shells and newspaper. As we can kind of tell, Nick himself is slightly conventional, right? Slightly old-fashioned in his tastes. But he is in a world where he engages with more modern painters like Barnby. What is the point of this, though? Why have this kind of comedic storyline in the background of St. John Clarke, this author converting to modernism? Obviously, modernism is in the air at the time. This is the early 1900s. So Anthony Powell is engaging, right, with the artistic trends of his time. But again, think about some of the themes we've talked about in the acceptance world. This fluidity between the adults and the younger people, the younger generation. St. John Clarke might be very old, might be an old man, but he is still transforming. He is still changing. He is still susceptible to conversions. He is not himself fixed in his worldviews. This is one of the big things Nick learns about adulthood in this book, is that the adults that he meets are at the same place that he is, in some cases, emotionally. They also are undergoing changes. They are also entering and exiting love affairs. They are also experiencing artistic transformations. It's part of Nick's broader lesson about what the acceptance world is, that everyone over 30 is all part of the same world, is all on the same level. There are fewer and fewer distinctions between the generations, between people his age and people who are older. I think these discussions of modernism, though, also just simply introduce this thematic question of how should reality be represented? Nick here makes fun of modernism a little bit as a style of art. Later, though, more seriously, he is going to reflect on what is the proper way to represent reality. There's a little moment in chapter 2 in that scene where he's waiting at the Ritz for Mark members. We're not going to read that chapter because it's kind of long, a little long section, but there's a little moment where he reflects on his own ability as a writer to reflect reality. He asks the question, how can I, as a writer, accurately represent people? It's interesting because he is doing a good job. Powell is doing a good job of representing people in a particular old-fashioned kind of style. But he has his narrator, Nick, question what is the right style to represent people in. And then later, I want to look at this moment in chapter 4 where Nick is at an art exhibition honoring Isbister, the painter who St. John Clarke never wrote the introduction for. And there's a little moment where Nick, kind of at the very beginning of chapter 4, reflects on Isbister's paintings and essentially criticizes them because he starts to feel that the sort of realistic, straightforward style that Isbister uses doesn't seem right. It no longer seems to really be the way to represent reality. So at the beginning of chapter 4, this is on page 106, at the very beginning. When, in early spring, pale sunlight was flickering behind the mist above Piccadilly, the Isbister Memorial Exhibition opened on the upper floor of one of the galleries there. I was attending the private view, partly for business reasons, partly from a certain weakness for bad pictures, especially bad portraits. Such a taste is hard to justify. Perhaps the inclination is no more than a morbid curiosity to see how far the painter will give himself away. Pictures, apart from their aesthetic interest, can achieve the mysterious fascination of those enigmatic scrawls on walls, the expression of heaven knows what psychological urge on the part of the executant. So, he begins the chapter with this kind of broad reflection on what he says, are bad pictures. He straight up says Isbister's paintings are bad. But what makes them bad? Well, in the next paragraph, he analyzes why. In Isbister's work, there was something of that inner madness, the deliberate naivete with which he accepted his businessmen, ecclesiastics, and mayors, depicted by him with all the crudeness of his accustomed application of paint to canvas, conveyed an oddly sinister effect. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Isbister set out to paint what he supposed to be the fashionable view of such people at any given moment. Thus, in his early days, a general, or the chairman of some big concern, would be represented in the respectively appropriate terms of Victorian romantic success. The former, hero of the battlefield; the latter, the industrious apprentice who has achieved his worthy ambition. But as military authority and commercial achievement became increasingly subject to political and economic denigration, Isbister, keeping up with the times, introduced a certain amount of what he judged to be satirical comment. So he then goes on to describe how, sometimes Isbister would try and work in some satirical idea about the person he's painting. But on the whole, the point is, the reason he considers Isbister to be a bad painter is Isbister at first tries too hard to just follow the trends of the time, to depict people in this certain realistic manner. And then later, still following the trends of the time, he tries to satirize them. He says here, if we jump later in the paragraph, "Indeed, often, even when there hung nearby something far worthier of regard, I found myself stealing a glance at an Isbister, dominating by its aggressive treatment the other pictures hanging about." So even though Isbister's paintings are bad paintings, he finds himself unable not to look at them. They're conventional. They reflect the times too much. What Nick is, I think, struggling with here, what Nick is really questioning, is the question of how to represent reality. How does one represent reality? These paintings are considered conventional, right? Isbister simply follows the times. First, he kind of follows the Victorian era, then he follows the more satirical early 20th century. And in both cases, Nick feels that his paintings fail to really capture reality in some way. That was, remember, Nick's question when he was sitting in the Ritz thinking, how is he as a writer going to capture reality? The same question comes up in the context of St. John Clarke, of St. John Clarke, a conventional novelist who writes conventional novels, which a lot of the fashionable characters don't like and kind of look down on, and yet he's also converting to modernism, which Nick also has some disdain for, right? Steel chairs, as he says. And so the constant question in all of this is, well, what is the right way to represent reality? And can you even represent reality? And I believe it all comes together in this wonderful scene at the very end of the novel, where Nick looks at a postcard from Jean and once again kind of offers a bit of art criticism. Let's look at this scene at the very end, because it's a strange scene to end the novel on. So, there's just been this climactic moment where Widmerpool has successfully put a drunk Stringham to bed, right? That's a really important scene in terms of the changes that are happening in the adult world, right? The idea that Widmerpool, the man of will, is now in power, and Stringham, Nick's old friend, now an alcoholic, has to be put to bed by Widmerpool, who is now the man in charge, right? The transformations of the adult world. But I really want to, that's a great scene. There's a lot to analyze there. But I think the importance of that scene is relatively straightforward when you read it. I think more interesting to me, and what I want to focus on here, is after that, Nick goes to meet Jean, and you think, okay, we're going to get one final scene between him and Jean. We do very briefly at the end, but actually, Powell spends a lot of time before that scene describing this postcard that he received from Jean. So let's look at the postcard. This is on page 210, at the very end of chapter 5. The card she had sent was of French origin, in color, showing a man and a woman seated literally one on top of the other in an armchair upholstered with crimson plush. These two exchanged ardent glances. They were evidently on the best of terms, because the young man, fair, though at the same time rather Semitic of feature, was squeezing the girl's arm just above the elbow. Wearing a suit of rich brown material, a tartan tie, and a diamond ring on the third finger of his right hand, his face, as he displayed a row of dazzling teeth, reminded me of Prince Theodoric's profile, as the prince might have been painted by Isbister. Now that's key. He looks at this postcard, this kind of conventional postcard of two lovers that Jean sends him, and he immediately thinks, oh, this looks like a portrait by Isbister. Remember, what did he think of Isbister? He thought Isbister was a bad painter because he was conventional, because he failed in some ways to capture reality, because he was too attached to the social conventions, to the Victorian era, and then to the early 20th century, that he shifted with the times, and it was considered, false in some way. Now he's looking at this card Gina sent him, and he's comparing it to an Isbister. He thinks the card is like an Isbister. Jumping ahead, the limits of the photograph, this is the description of the girl, caused her legs to fade suddenly from the picture. An unexpected subordination of design created either to conceal an impression of squatness or possibly a purely visual effect, the result of foreshortening, rather than because these lower limbs failed, in the eyes of the photographer, to attain a required standard of elegance. So the photograph, on this card, it just abruptly ends, is the idea. The legs just sort of fade away. And Nick can't help but notice that this makes the photograph seem slightly artificial in some ways. What does he say? An unexpected subordination of design, right? It's the limits of the photograph. It's a visual effect. And then there's a French caption below the photograph. We don't have to read the French caption, but the title of the photograph is Sex Appeal. The French quote is just something that Nick realizes is very relevant to his relationship with Jean. And then he continues to describe the photograph in a lot of detail. He goes into detail about the background, about what he sees. And he ends, though, with this reflection. So jumping one paragraph ahead on page 212. Contemplating the blended tones of pink and brown framed within the postcard's scalloped edges of gold, one could not help thinking how extraordinarily unlike the real thing was this particular representation of a pair of lovers. Indeed, how indifferently, at almost every level except the highest, the ecstasies and bitterness of love are at once conveyed in art. So what is Nick's response to this photograph, to this postcard? He realizes, it doesn't actually convey what love is really like. It doesn't convey the ecstasies and bitterness. What are the ecstasies and bitterness he's talking about? Well, obviously, the ecstasy is him and Jean together, right? We've seen those moments of ecstasy, such as him in the car. And what is the bitterness? The bitterness is what his emotional journey, right? He's realized that Jean also had a love affair with Jimmy Stripling, and this changes the currency, as we said. This leads him to question the romantic value of what they had, because he cannot imagine that she could do this with Jimmy as well, someone who he doesn't respect and doesn't really look highly upon. And that's the bitterness he's talking about. That's the bitterness of love. And he feels that this art, this photograph, which is like an Isbister, it doesn't do justice to the real thing. Nick, at the very end of this novel, has come face to face with the fact that maybe art cannot represent reality. If we keep reading, so much of the truth remains finally unnegotiable, in spite of the fact that most persons in love go through remarkably similar experiences. Here in the picture, for example, implications were misleading, if not positively inaccurate. The matter was presented as all too easy, the twin flames of dual egotism reduced almost to nothing, so that there was no pain, and for that matter, almost no pleasure. A sense of anxiety, without which the condition could scarcely be held to exist, was altogether absent. So he's extending his critique of the photograph again by saying, even though we all go through similar experiences of love, there is something that just cannot be captured by a photograph or a painting or any image. There is, he says there's the flames of dual egotism, which is a great phrase to describe essentially what he and Jean went through. He has his egotism, she has her egotism. They have that fight over Jimmy Stripling, right? He is condescending and critical of Jimmy, and she reveals that she had an affair with him as well. Those are the flames of dual egotism. There's no pain, there's no anxiety, and so for him, it's not real. This image of these two lovers, this photograph, it's not real because it has none of that. In a way, what Nick is realizing is that photographs, paintings, they cannot capture these real human feelings. Now, what's interesting, though, do we think Nick feels this way about writing? I'm not sure in this case Nick reaches a conclusion yet. He doesn't reflect directly on writing. Remember, he asked that question earlier about how, as a writer, he could represent actual people. But I think as readers, we have to kind of read this on a metatextual level. I mean, Powell has successfully done what Nick feels that this photograph cannot do. Powell actually has conveyed love as it really is. The egotism, the anxiety, the pain, and the pleasure. In a way, I mean, I think what Powell is very subtly doing here is he's saying words are better than paintings. Novels are better than paintings. They are more successful and more real than paintings. And that's quite a statement, but it makes sense for a novelist to make a statement like that and to say that. I don't think that is really an interpretation that Nick reaches in this book. I think that is, as I said, a metatextual kind of subtle implication that we can glean from the novel as a novel, right? From the way Powell writes and from the way he successfully conveys this relationship. It is implied but not stated. It's just something interesting, though, and I think it again just speaks to Powell's power as a writer, that he is able to convey what Nick is frustrated paintings and photographs cannot convey, the real, painful, anxious experience of love. And then let's keep reading, though, because Nick's reflection is really nice here. Yet after all, even the crude image of the postcard depicted, with at least a degree of truth, one side of love's outward appearance. That had to be admitted. Some of love was like the picture. I had enacted such scenes with Jean, Templar with Mona. Now Mona was enacting them with Quiggin, Barnby and Umfreville with Anne Stepney, Stringham with her sister Peggy, Peggy now in the arms of her cousin, Uncle Giles very probably with Mrs. Erdley, Mrs. Erdley with Jimmy Stripling, if it came to that, with Jean and Duport too. I mean, what a wonderful paragraph where he just takes us through the train of love affairs. And I like that list because he brings it all together. He sort of shows us, well, we've seen all of these images of lovers and love affairs and marriages falling apart and women leaving men for others. And what does it all build to? Well, here he has this wonderful little train. He starts with him and Jean, and he goes through the different love affairs that do in some ways reflect the image on the picture, the image on the photograph, on the card. And then he ends with Jimmy and Jean and Duport, who is Jean's husband. In that little listing is all of Nick's buried emotions about how he feels, the anxiety he feels for Jean. So he sort of acknowledges that even though the painting doesn't capture the inner anxieties, it is still real in some ways. It does capture the outward appearance of love. And it ends with him, so the very end of the novel, right, he meets Jean, they have a little conversation, and, they talk about the fact that Duport, her husband, is coming back and that it's going to be difficult for her and Nick to continue. That's implicitly what they say. They're not officially breaking up, but she's implicitly kind of noting that, my husband is coming back and it's going to make things difficult. And they decide not to talk about that. But look at this last paragraph. Outside, a clock struck the hour. Though ominous, things still had their enchantment. After all, as St. John Clark was reported to have said at the Huntercombes, all blessings are mixed blessings. Perhaps in spite of everything, the couple of the postcard could not be dismissed so easily. It was in their world that I seemed now to find myself. So what a wonderful final sentence. It was in their world that I seemed now to find myself. The use of the word world. It is impossible when you're reading a book called The Acceptance World that then ends with a sentence that uses the word world for us not to draw that connection. The world of the couple in the postcard, this unreal postcard that Nick has been critiquing as a sort of false image of love, of what love is really like, he says that is the acceptance world. What does he mean by that? What does he mean that he is now in that world? Here's my analysis and interpretation of this final section, right? What is Nick accepting at the end? He is accepting that his romance with Jean is not the romantic romance that he imagined it to be when they first began, because he has been struck by kind of the brutal truth that she also had an affair with Jimmy Stripling, and that as a result, this image of love that he sees on the postcard, it's not just what he and Jean did together. it's also what Jean and Jimmy did. And that sort of sickens Nick to some extent. It makes him queasy. He doesn't like to imagine or to know that. But that is reality. That is the acceptance world. That is adulthood. That is life after 30, that he has to realize that those romantic, childish ideas that he had about what real love is, those are the ideas of a younger man that he has to put aside now. He has to accept the reality of the bitterness of love. He has to accept that Jean also had a love affair with Jimmy Stripling, that what he and Jean are sharing is not unique to them, that it is something she has shared with other people. That is something a lot of the characters have to accept, especially a lot of the male characters. They accept in this novel that their women are going to be with other people, right? Mona leaves Templar for Quiggin. Anne Stepney leaves Barnby for Dickie Umfreville. Mrs. Erdley leaves Uncle Giles for Jimmy Stripling. A lot of characters leave for other characters, leave to be with other characters. And so we have this kind of constant flux in a way. And if the photograph on the postcard represents what Nick calls an unreal false idea of love, an outward idea of love that doesn't reveal the inner bitterness and turmoil and anxiety, what Nick has to accept in the end is maybe for now, this outward image of love is enough. Maybe the postcard, maybe the two lovers in the postcard, maybe that's enough. I mean, obviously, Jean sent him the postcard. So all of his criticisms of the postcard and of the image on the postcard can be read as kind of this veiled, subtle criticism of Jean and of her view of love and of the failure, of her failure to live up to the ideal of love that he had in his head. But in the end, he accepts her, and he accepts it, and he accepts love's limitations. By saying at the end that the world of the postcard is now the world that he is a part of, that it is the acceptance world, Nick is accepting the limitations of love. If we go back to the beginning, right, this whole idea of the acceptance world, remember what we said. The acceptance world is this idea that you kind of take out a loan of happiness. And then when the goods are delivered, you pay back the loan and hopefully you've made a profit. But sometimes you haven't. Sometimes you lose. Sometimes the currency changes. And part of the acceptance world is taking the risk and accepting the costs, whatever they will be. And that is what Nick learns to do at the end. He takes the risk. He knows there will be a cost. It's sort of implied that the cost is Jean's husband is coming back. This love affair will not last forever, and it will end. But he accepts it anyway, and he says, I now enter the world of the postcard, the acceptance world. If we reflect on this in general, it's such a wonderful way of conveying what adulthood is like. What did he say earlier? The illusions that you have to shed when you enter adulthood, when you cross the threshold of 30. Once again, with this novel, as he's done with the past two novels, Powell really insightfully describes a transformation in a person's life, a subtle transformation that, despite its subtlety, is very profound. It's a very profound moment in a person's life, crossing the threshold of 30 and all of the new realities of the adult world that you have to learn and contend with as a result. The risk, the loss of illusion, all of it. I don't think I've read a novel that so artfully and subtly conveys the experience of becoming an adult like this one. The previous novel, I said the same thing about the idea of love. I say the same thing here about the idea of what adulthood means. Powell, this is why I think Powell is probably my favorite writer, why these books are some of my favorite novels ever written, because of the subtle power that Powell is able to bring to describe these transformations in human life. As I said before, a lot of the specific details of these characters' lives are not like my own. They live in a world that's totally different, with different concerns, and yet it speaks to me, and I think it speaks to other people on a more universal level, because turning 30, becoming an adult, entering the acceptance world is something we still go through 100 years later. The details might be different, but the contours of the experience are the same or are very similar. And so again, that's why novels hit you the way they hit you. That's why novels speak to people over decades and centuries. Novels that are well written speak to people in this way because they touch on universal experiences. And I think Powell most certainly does that in this novel, as well as in future novels. So we'll wrap up there for today. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all, as always. We're going to do the next novel in the series, At Lady Molly's, in another month. As always, remember, the pace we're setting here with these novels is one a month. In between that, we will do other novels, poems, plays, as always. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. And I'll see you all next time.